There are at least two other reasons why you might, why it's wise, I think, to acknowledge your current problems, to bring people in before you solve a problem instead of after you solve a problem. The reason I've offered so far is if they watch you solve the problem, it's much more credible than if you tell them you solved the problem. So for so far I've focused on the credibility building experience of watching you solve the problem. But there are two other reasons worth talking about. Okay, and one is when you bring people in before you solve a problem, okay, and you tell them about the problem early, you are establishing a rebuttable presumption that when you have a problem, you tell people about it early. And that implies that when you haven't told somebody about a problem, it must not be your problem. Okay? Now, let me give you an example so that you can see the way that works. I worked with a company that had terrible community relations. And one of the things they decided they would do in order to improve their community relations is anytime anything happened on site, this was a refinery, anytime anything happened at the refinery that was detectable off-site, they would call the local police department and tell the desk sergeant. So if a neighbor called and said, "What's going on?" Okay, the desk sergeant could say, "Oh yeah, the refinery called, here's the problem." In the first 5 months of this new policy, the company made 19 calls to the cops. None of them were a result of their emergency response plan. All were a result of this new public affairs plan. Okay. Then one day after 19 calls, after 5 months, one day there was an acrid odor wafting through the community. Okay. And scores of people called the police and said, "What's that smell?" And the desk sergeant said, "I don't know. But it can't be the refinery or they would have called." Now they earned that with 19 technically unnecessary telephone calls. Now, no, it wasn't. I mean, obviously, if it had turned out it was the refinery, they would have lost it again. I mean, I'm not saying that if you tell us about problems early, you earn the right to lie about one later. Kind of like a mulligan in golf. It doesn't work that way. Okay? But what I am saying is once you establish a precedent that when you have a problem, you tell people about it before you solve it. Okay? Then when they sense a problem and you haven't told them about it, it creates a rebuttable presumption it must not be your problem, because when it's your problem, you tell people. Okay? And if you don't violate that presumption, if it isn't your problem, that's extremely valuable to organizations, because organizations are often blamed for problems that aren't theirs. And if you can get it into people's head that when it's yours, you say so, so if you haven't said anything, it's probably not yours, that's extremely valuable. The third reason for involving people early, for telling them about problems before you solve them, results from two realities I haven't mentioned yet. One is problem solving isn't dichotomous. Okay? We don't actually either solve or fail to solve the problem. We solve as much of the problem as we can, or as much of the problem as we have to. So it's not a dichotomy. The other reality is the cost of problem solving increases as you get closer to the end of the problem. Does this make sense to everybody? Okay, so the first 90% of the problem is cheaper to solve than the last 10%. The first 9% of the last 10% is cheaper to solve than the last 1%. Okay? And getting the very last molecule of dimethyl meatloaf out of the groundwater is infinitely expensive. Given those two realities, that problem solving is not dichotomous and that the cost keeps increasing as you get closer to finishing the solution, let's add one other reality. People discount the value of that part of the solution that happens before they get there. Okay? They just don't discount it down to zero, but they discount it very substantially. So the problem solving they watch is more valuable to them than the problem solving they're told about. Given all of that, it becomes very cost effective not to do the early cheap part of the problem solving before your critics get there. because eventually you will have solved 90% of the problem or 98% of the problem or whatever it is, and you're going to want to stop. You're not going to want to get the last molecule of dimethyl meatloaf out of the groundwater. And in the negotiation, in the discussion over whether you have done enough, it is enormously in your interest that the early, inexpensive part of the solution didn't happen before people were there, so that they're not discounting it. All three of those it seems to me, are the three dominant reasons why it makes sense for an organization to bring in their critics before they get the problem solved, early in the problem-solving process. The reason not to do it is, again, mostly ego. I think it goes against organizational norms to let anybody watch you flail. Nobody likes to be watched until they've got their ducks in a row. So it's very, very hard for organizations to do this, but all three of those advantages are there, waiting for you if you're willing to follow that strategy.